I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are a UK-based certified social enterprise with a reach into 20 countries, but most of our activity is UK-based. We are, as I mentioned, a certified social enterprise, which means that we operate as a not-for-profit. Our purpose is to create an impact, not to make money. And our focus is all on the financial system. We want the financial sector to be more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy. In broad terms, we would argue that the financial industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society. The financial sector permeates into all of our lives in many different ways, and frankly, modern society would not be the same if we were to extract the financial sector from it. I have no doubt in my mind that when it behaves well, it's wonderful. It really is wonderful. It can help people buy their homes. It can provide an income in the event of a breadwinner's early death. It can provide financial security in old age. It can and does do many, many wonderful things. However, it does have a predisposition to misbehave. And the evidence tells us that the financial sector's predisposition to misbehave can be quite extreme, so much so that every now and then it causes the entire system to crash. Of course, we can go back to 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis. And of course, there have been previous iterations of other crises going back through the generations. The question is, why does that happen? Given that it's a regulated industry, what is it that the regulators are doing or aren't doing that are allowing it, inverted commas, to misbehave so badly? What about the companies themselves? What is it that's causing them to behave the way that they do? And of course, the underlying question behind all of this is what can it do to make the world a better place? What can we do to raise standards? What can we do to help ensure that people are looked after by the industry rather than exploited by it? These are serious questions. At one end of the extreme, malpractice in the financial sector can cause things like the global financial crisis, as I mentioned. At the other extreme, it can cause people to quite literally take their lives because of banking misconduct that resulted in them, for example, having their family businesses stolen away by bankers. Really pleased. I'm really, you hear me now, Nick? Yeah. I'm really pleased that we do have something of a subject matter expert with us tonight in terms of corporate governance. We have Dominique Muller with us. Dominique is with Corporate Justice Coalition, an organization I've been getting to know a little bit over the years. It's certainly an organization that is very, very relevant to the Transparency Task Force community. And I'm ever so pleased that we're lucky enough to have Dominique's time with us for the next hour and a half or so to talk about corporate governance issues. Before we do anything else, folks, can we please show our appreciation to Dominique for being here tonight and talking about the work that she does? It's very relevant to what we do. Dominique, you are ever so welcome. Please do take yourself off mute. And when you're ready to, please tell us a bit about yourself, the organization, your thoughts on corporate governance. And of course, the question is why we must hold corporations to account and how we can do it. Over to you. Thank you.
Lovely. Oh, it's so nice to get appreciation before I've spoken. Might need to take that back, but I hope it will be of interest to you all. So my name's Dominique Muller. I have been with the Corporate Justice Coalition, or CJC, for about 6 months or so. I'm doing maternity cover. And my background is with Amnesty International, working on Chinese human rights, death penalty, supply chains, then with the International Trade Union Confederation based in Hong Kong, and then more recently looking at the fashion industry and global supply chains with the Clean Clothes campaign. I do have a slideshow, and I am going to find the right window. So I'll go through a little bit about who we are and why we exist. So we've been going for about, I think, 15, 20 years, and the main reason that we exist, and we're also a charity, is that we call for business responsibility and accountability. And we base much of our work on the UN Guiding Principles, which I'm sure some of you are fully aware of. And the UN Guiding Principles were developed about 15 years ago, originally called the Ruggie Principles. And now, increasingly, these guiding principles for business and human rights are being transferred into national, and in the case of the EU, regional legislation, seeking to hold companies to account, but also to hold states to account for corporate harms committed in the states, but also by, for example, in the case of the UK companies, and crucially also providing the right to remedy for victims and survivors. So let me just move that. So the responsibility to respect human rights is a global standard for all business enterprises, wherever they operate, regardless of what the state does, and it exists over and above any national legislation. Businesses have to undertake due diligence, prevent, address, and remedy harms that they contribute to, that they cause, but also that they might encourage. And at the same time, states have to protect against human rights abuses in their territory and jurisdiction by third parties, including business. So our campaign is, I'm going to skip that, is a coalition of over 70 partners. These partners are mainly UK based, but they're also global. So we've got some big ones like Amnesty, Anti-Slavery, Friends of the Earth, very big. We've also got trade unions like Unison and the TUC. And then we've got very small ones, for example, the Forest Peoples Programme, or Labour Behind the Label, or the London Mining Network. And what we do, we're a very small organisation. There's 4 of us, and we work, it is equivalent to 3.8 staff, and we coordinate the work of our partners. We amplify what they do. We also do a lot of advice in terms of lobbying and advocacy support for partners. But importantly, what we do is to provide them guidance in how their own issues relate to legislation in the UK. So, for example, when we have Forest Peoples Programme or Indigenous groups, they're looking at issues affecting communities in Colombia, for example. They know their stuff really well, and our partners cover huge range of abuses, huge range of sectors, but they don't necessarily know how to turn that into legislative proposals for the government, the UK government, to actually hold companies to account. So that's what we try to do. And obviously, as Andy has said about the predisposition of financial companies to abuses or malpractice, I think it's pretty clear that all around the world, all companies do this. Some people would say this is simply capitalism. Others would say this is very much related to the idea that a company is there for profit. It's there to make money for their shareholders. But it is also a combination of the growth of big companies. So we have companies that are bigger than in terms of money and turnover than small countries' GDP. We have companies that have supply chains reaching into every small country or region in the world, and we have a whole issues, for example, in the UK, related to the things that we eat, the things that we wear, the bags that we buy, the banks that we use. And these harms are not only in the UK, but they're also global. So this is just a little snapshot of some of the cases that really relate to UK companies. So this, we focus just on UK companies, but also UK companies that might be with the London Stock Exchange or do a lot of work in the UK. And you can see there's issues, for example, in the DRC around palm oil. There's issues around deforestation in Brazil. There's again mining in Colombia. There's sweatshops in the UK. There's forced labor in China, and the list goes on. And I think what we have seen over the years is that there's been a proliferation of voluntary standards. There's been a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives that companies and others have set up to try and, in a sense, in response to the increasing exposés of abuses and the increasing ability of vulnerable communities to make their voices heard. But we don't see much progress in terms of holding companies to account. We don't see a lot of progress in terms of the ability of victims to take companies to court. And so what we're really pushing for at the moment is this idea in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights of due diligence. So really, and apologies for those of you who know this off by heart. Due diligence is a process, but it's also a tool. And I think sometimes when policymakers look at due diligence, they see it only as a process. And they see it as the end goal. So, for example, companies do increasingly do undertake due diligence. They do identify and assess the impacts of their operations. They look at their supply chains, their business relations. And then the idea is that they should then cease or prevent adverse impacts, track the implementation and the results of this due diligence process, and then communicate how those impacts are addressed. And right in the middle, we've got embed responsible business conduct. So the UNGP is very clear that it needs buy-in right from the top, and companies should undertake due diligence and also know their supply chain and show what they're doing. So this principle of knowing and showing is key. And then finally, we have step number 6, which is to provide remediation as much as possible. There's a lot of other principles in the UNGP around things like leverage. So where you have harms that are primarily caused by one company, but another company is involved, you're supposed to work together to resolve this. And what we have done, I'm not sure you're all missing bits of it, of the slide because of this top bar. The CJC has worked with a team of lawyers and policymakers to build a draft Business, Human Rights and Environment Act. And this act is very clear that issues around human rights abuses and negative environmental impact, you can't divide it. It's increasingly clear that issues around the environment are human rights. Maybe 40 years ago they weren't, but they are considered now. And although some people often try to divide issues around human rights, let's say forced labor, from environmental impact, we're clear that the two must be seen together. And we're pushing government to implement a new law which would mandate all UK registered businesses, including, and again, this is quite crucial, the public sector, to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence. And we do this in several different ways. Oh, I've gone too fast. And increasingly, probably over the last even year and a half, we've seen a real momentum behind this. I think as we see in the UK, the failure of UK legislation around issues in the UK, like water, sewage, Grenfell, as well as continued exposés of Shell, for example, overseas. We're seeing increasing numbers of unions and civil society organisations supporting us. We've recently handed in a petition to Parliament in February, and we commissioned some polling, and 4 in 5 people that were polled support mandatory human rights due diligence. On top of that, we also have businesses. So we work very much in advocacy towards MPs, to ministers. We have a website that highlights a pledge that we ask MPs to undertake. And we also work with businesses and investors in last year and a couple of years ago to ask their support for them to share letters. So I can send you the links to that. But we now, it says 55 parliamentarians, we now have 70. So this slide was done in February. So we can see a real trend that is increasing, especially with this Labour government. So these are some of the businesses that have signed up to support mandatory human rights due diligence. Obviously, for those of you who are in business, you will probably know that it's relatively easy for a business to say, yes, we support mandatory human rights due diligence for various reasons, for sustainability, but also to provide a level playing field. But as we go further along into legislation, we do recognise that we're going to have pushback in terms of the actual details of the law. So I'm going to just quickly go through. I'm going to do all the slides, the key principles, and this might be interesting to those of you who are like legal principles. But it also makes it clear that what we're proposing isn't just a process, a due diligence process, but we also want to see very clear duties put on businesses and for businesses to have very strong transparency requirements. And we also want to see civil penalties, both for the organisation and for their senior leadership team. We want to see liability for harm, loss and damage arising from their failure to prevent. We also want to see criminal penalties if they fail to prevent this. Obviously, there would be thresholds. And again, this includes all businesses, no matter their size, nature or sector, and it includes public sector. So this is slightly different to, for example, the current weak omnibus due diligence legislation that is being discussed in the EU, and also some other legislation, for example, in France, which excludes companies with small turnovers. We want to see all companies subject to this. And the UN guiding principles is also very clear about proportionality, that smaller companies will not be subject to the same amount of work, resources, and often money that larger companies will have to undertake when they do their due diligence. So two key principles. One is on the duty to prevent harm. So we're very clear that it's the duty of businesses to prevent harm. And once this harm happens, it's on the business to show that they took reasonable steps to prevent harm from happening. And the failure to prevent model is closely linked to this. And what we've done is to incorporate what was a very good model, and was quite transformative, I think, in terms of the Bribery Act on bribery. And it's a duty of result as opposed to duty of process. So it's not whether or not the company has done adequate due diligence, but it's whether there was harm. This has also been recommended in 2017 by the Joint Committee on Human Rights, but they interestingly did a report last month, or was it 2 months ago, reaffirming their support for this. And the reason why we want to do this, actually, let's see what we have now. And I've put at the top, I've taken some of the key words from Transparency Task Force, I suppose, focus, but it holds true of most companies and most sectors. In order to actually get remedy, huge burden of proof, takes a long time. There is no proactive duty of care. Many of the regulations and the specific regulators have very narrow and restrictive definitions. It's also increasingly hard to hold companies to account
Yep.
because of, yeah, the decision making, but also, in industry because of the supply chains. So it's difficult to prove systemic issues, and there's a lot of buck passing, which often means that for the smaller companies, they're the ones that get the blame because they're the ones that have caused the harm, and it's hard to prove the link back to the HQ. So what we're hoping in our bill is that we're going to have this clear duty to prevent harm that would run throughout the value chain. You can't pass the buck. It reverses this burden of proof. So the victims have to show the harm, and they don't have to prove that the company failed to prevent it. So it would be a harm has happened, and it's up to the company to prove that they did the due diligence to prevent it, because everyone knows things happen. So it is a reasonable excuse for a company to say, we did the due diligence. So it's both a protection for the victim, but also a protection for the company. Again, currently, we have regulators that often avoid public bodies or public procurement. A couple of examples, we have the Great British Energy Bill. We recently pushed for an amendment which would look at forced labour in the supply chains, which was great, but it only applies to the Great British Energy Bill, for example. It doesn't apply to other bills. The same with the MSA, which is the Modern Slavery Act. Again, that focuses on forced labour. It doesn't really have sanctions. It's very weak on transparency. Companies over, I think, 36 million have to write a statement, but there's no real oversight of what that statement involves, and there's no effective sanctions. Again, on a similar act, but this time looking at the environment, we have, I think it's Schedule 17 on deforestation. That has recently been introduced, and it's being revised, and it looks at issues around deforestation, but it again, it only links to certain sectors. So we have this patchwork that we've heard from businesses means that they don't know what they have to do. They have several different regulators, especially, for example, for retail chains that cover all sectors. They have to keep up with different requirements, some of which are onerous, some of which are not. So our BHREA, it links specific issues to a single legal solution, cutting across sectors, holding all companies to account. And for the communities that are partners, skip too close. For the communities that our partners work with, there is more potential for successful cases. So it won't be beholden on, for example, communities in Nigeria to try to take Shell to court and get a huge legal team behind them to counter the power of a company. So that's really what we do. I'm happy to take any questions, and I've got Lots of questions because I think you are the experts in terms of finance, and I know Andy would be happy to start this discussion
Sure.
on yeah, how does financial misconduct, how do banks and others, how would they fit in? What would be the role of regulators? And also, more generally, if any of you want to get in contact, see if you want to join as a partner or just learn a little bit more about how the work that you do can fit in and how the work we do can support you. And I will stop sharing.
Dominic, that was great. You've given us a lovely overview of where your focus is and where your attention is. There are several things I really liked about what you explained, Dominic. In particular, I like the way your proposal doesn't shy away from making individuals accountable. It seemed from what you were explaining, Dominic, that you are happy that there would be consequences to the individuals if there was malpractice of some kind by a company. And I think that's absolutely key to this. You're making me think about um, changes to corporate manslaughter laws many years ago, where I think I'm right in saying there were many people being killed on building sites because the levels of, the standards around health and safety were pretty atrocious. And all kinds of efforts have been made to persuade companies to do this to make it safer and do that to make it safer, but none of it really had any impact. Then what happened was the corporate manslaughter legislation occurred, which basically made it possible for the people at the very top of the companies to be held personally accountable if somebody died on a building site and they couldn't prove that they did all they could have and should have done to actually stop it from happening. And my understanding is, I'm no expert, that the rate of accidents, the rate of deaths just fell. We're going to hear from Stuart Woolard later. He knows a lot about this subject. He might well want to comment and elaborate on what I've just said. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. If you don't hold individuals accountable, the chances of a company just carry on behaving the way that they have been is just really high. In fact, Dominic, if you don't mind, I'm going to share some information. Some of you will have seen this information before. Um, it's a database called Violation Tracker. I'm just going to go and share my screen here. Here we go. So for those of you that haven't seen it before, this is a database of corporate infringements. And it's a great database, by the way, just to go off on a bit of a sort of sales pitch for it, for want of a better phrase. What it is basically an amalgamation or an aggregation of the data available from all these different regulatory authorities. I think that, all the important ones are there. It's massive. And what the database does is bring it all together. Now, obviously, the one that's of real interest to us is financial services. So if I go to, for example, data from the Financial Conduct Authority, um, you'll see what I mean in just a second. We can go to, um, forgive me, we can go to parent industry databases. Bear with me a second. There we go. If we put in here other summaries, and we click on parent industry totals, it gives you a ranking of all the different industries ranked by how much they've been fined. And if we go to financial services, which is what I'm going to do now, it gives us the top 10 worst offending companies. And most of those, as you can see, folks, are household names. And it then gives you a list of all the individual fines ranked by how big they are. So the one at the top, Credit Suisse, parent company UBS, banking violations in 2021 by the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, that resulted in a fine of 292 million pounds. I mean, how much bad do you have to do to warrant a fine of 292 pounds? But I'm going to get to an important point here. If you scroll down, what you start to see is a pattern. Quite literally, the same organizations being caught over and over again for the same things. And I think they call that recidivism. Recidivism is where the behavior doesn't change once people have been caught and found out and told off or prosecuted, whatever it might be. And this speaks to the importance of the point that you made earlier, Dominique, because it would occur to us looking at the data that these are companies who've probably made a fortune doing the malpractice, end up paying what looks like a massive fine, but it's actually small compared to the money they made doing what they shouldn't have been doing. But in virtually every case, the individuals in the bank doing whatever they were doing, who were responsible for what happened, aren't held to account. And that lack of personal accountability is, I think, what is missing from so many of the various good corporate conduct standards. A company is individuals. It's a legal entity, but it's built around individuals. Unless you do something to hold those individuals to account, you really are not going to be pressing the right buttons, because unless somebody's held to account, they're going to find ways to duck and dive and escape from it. Dominic, do you want to just come back to me on that particular point, the importance of holding people to account? I'd love to know if you think it's as important as I feel I do. Thank you.
No, definitely. And I think you're right on the corporate manslaughter. It really did change the industry, having directors culpable. And I gave a presentation to a really interesting set of victim-centered groups
Right.
who were all focused on corporate manslaughter, but it was victims, let's say, of NHS failures, but also of gambling. So there were people there that were their family members had committed suicide and they were looking for accountability from the gambling companies that promote
Right.
them.
Right.
Um, and that was one thing that came across. It was the companies would very much stonewall them, and no one person would take accountability. And I think if you have named directors that take accountability, that is crucial. And also having that dual thing of civil liability and criminal liability, let's say with different thresholds. Um, and I know I think Alex mentioned that you would maybe talk about the Better Business Act.
Yes. Yes.
What?
Thank you. In fact,
Yeah.
let's go to that. Let's go to that, because I think that um, there are some signs of hope in the system. Um, I think the Better Business Act and related activity around it is actually potentially pretty helpful for us. Um, there's an article here. I'll share my screen if I may. And after I've sort of explained this, we'll go to Stuart Woolard. I'd like Stuart to introduce himself and talk about his own organisation and what he does, because it seems to me that it's very complementary to the work that you're doing, Dominic. So um, let's go to this. So, folks, this is an article by the High Pay Centre. You every now and then you hear about the High Pay Centre. They're normally the organisation that the radio or the TV goes to when somebody's being paid a huge amount of money and they want some kind of commentary about it. So, this is the case for reforming directors' legal duties. It's obviously relevant to the topic we're discussing tonight. It's from June this year. And it talks about the idea of changing the primacy of shareholders. And in broad terms, what it's basically saying is the 2006 Companies Act um, makes profit primary and everything else is secondary to that. So we have a bit of an issue here. On one hand, we want our companies to behave nicely and properly, look after the planet, look after people, look after staff, look after everything. But because of this perception, or perhaps reality, that the company has a legal responsibility to maximize shareholder return in the short term, our companies aren't thinking about making the world a better place. They're thinking about doing whatever they need to do to screw as much profit as they can out of the system in the short term. And that therefore is the conflict of interest, the conflict of priorities. Again, yourself and Stuart might want to speak to that. I'm also going to share a link to the actual bill itself, um, which I will refer to if I may. Bear with me just a second. Again, I'll try to share my screen. Here it is. So This is the Company Directors Duties Bill. It's working its way through Parliament at the minute. The long title is a bill to amend Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006 to require company directors to balance their duty. Interesting phrase, to balance their duty, i.e., to no longer make maximizing profit the primary objective. They now need to balance their duty to promote the success of the company with duties in respect of the environment and the company's employees. So a broader base for the activity that's going on. It's working its way through the system slowly. Um, Stuart, why don't I take this opportunity, if I may, to invite you to introduce yourself and your organisation and speak to what we've been discussing tonight. Feel free to take the conversation where you'd like to. And please do comment, Stuart, about the importance you place on there being individual accountability in the system. Stuart, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Hopefully you can all hear me.
Yeah.
I haven't put together a presentation, but I'll do my best to summarize what I do. I'm one of the founders of a not-for-profit organization called the Maturity Institute, and we set ourselves up just over 10 years ago to understand the health of an organization through a human lens as opposed to a financial lens, and to really quantify the value of people, if you like, within an organizational context. And that's not just the workforce, but it's all the human relationships that an organization has. So when it comes to supply chains and layers of supply chains, that's all part of that whole human system, if you like. And so we're assessing and measuring the health of that whole human system. So when an organization has slavery in its supply chain, that's indicative of something bigger. I was just on your point, Dominique, about systemic issues and how you prove systemic issues. What we found in looking at literally hundreds of organizations is that it's very rare that issues of slavery or the exploitation of people or natural resources is an isolated incident, that it's bad apples or rogue employees. These are generally systemic or cultural problems which continue to manifest. And talk to what Andy was talking about, where, why do we have recidivism? Well, until organizations accept that the issues that occur often in their failure are not isolated, then these things don't get solved. It might be helpful for me just to show you, if I'm able to share my screen.
Yeah.
A quick, if I can just do this. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is how we measure firms. So we actually measure organizations against 32 different human health or human value factors, from purpose to values to decision making to how companies learn, how they manage performance, et cetera, et cetera. And I just thought this and this is a scale we create. I've actually we've been producing ratings ever since 2015, when we were invited to rate the FTSE 100 for the Institute of Directors Good Governance Index. That was the first big exercise we did. A lot of our work with Andy has been with the banking community, because we did a big banking sector study in 2018, 2019, looking at banking misconduct. So this scale essentially mirrors the Standard & Poor's rating scale. And as you see on the right-hand side, we regard mature organizations as those that seek to generate value for all their stakeholders through realizing human potential. And in fact, what we found is that organizations that actually do manage human value as opposed to exploit human beings tend to outperform their peers. So they do tend to actually make more money over the longer term, but they also generate benefits for all their stakeholders. Companies to the left-hand side of the scale are highly exploitative. Boohoo is a very good example. Dominic, you mentioned Boohoo, where the issues that they found in their factories in Leicester precipitated a pretty stark collapse in their share price over the last 3 or 4 years. And even though some, responsible asset managers are major shareholders in Boohoo, they've lost a lot of money by investing in a company that is highly exploitative. And so, Boohoo, we haven't actually rated Boohoo, but they will be well down on this scale. I'll give you some examples. So we've looked at the water industry quite recently and tried to shine a light on water companies. So Thames Water is a CCC rated company. And that compares, if you look at banks like Handelsbanken, which would be kind of A+, AA-. So it gives you a sense of the difference in scale. Late last year, we released what we call the Law Firm Maturity Index. So we rated, there's now nearly 50 law firms in a live index of law firms. And that slide just shows the sort of the range of ratings that we had for those law firms. And that's allowed us to start, working with law firms, encouraging them to be accountable for who they are. But also, interestingly, it captures the sort of imagination of insurance, who provide professional indemnity insurance, where human risk is very real. And if you, exploit your staff and you cause issues of stress and burnout, that causes mistakes. And obviously, that's an insurance risk that causes increases in premiums, and these aren't inexpensive. And we're also trying to get the attention of the Solicitors Regulation Authority. Regulators we've had quite some interesting dealings with regulators over the years, from the New York Fed to the FCA to the PRA and so on and so forth, and saying, look, hey, we should be assessing and measuring, human related health, because, just looking at the financials is not enough. And you all talk about culture, you all talk about human risk, you all talk about this stuff, and we should be trying to measure it. So hopefully that gives you a little sense of what we do. I'll just stop sharing if I can. I'm not sure how I do that.
I'll take care of that. I think I should be able to.
Yeah, here we go. Stop share. But yeah, I mean, the whole area of human rights and is something we've encountered quite a lot, and we build into what we do. So I think from my perspective, I'm always somewhat, I regard myself as a naively optimistic. And why do I say that? I guess 10 years ago, I sat down with a senior fund manager in London and said, how much does it matter to you if a major organization has got slavery in its supply chain or child labor in its operations? And he looked at me and said, well, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't matter two hoots about our investment decisions. And I think that in today's world, where that has changed, right? So we have seen companies like VW, their cars have been impounded in New York ports because they've found there was allegations of using Uyghurs in their supply chain. That matters to business. So suddenly doing harm does matter to the value of the share price and your reputation, et cetera, et cetera. So there has been a shift, but I think as the work of Dominic's still a long way to go. We're still a long way. We still have a system where the system is still built around a definition of value which is still largely financial in orientation. We still reward profitability as a primary determinant of success over societal impact, and there's a long way to get a much better balance. I think what we're trying to do in our work is showing that actually the best companies they are responsible and they make more money, and the more we can shine a light on that, the better, I think. And a question to Dominique, really. I know you showed a load of companies who, particularly the major multinationals, are always too keen to sign up to initiatives. I just wondered if you had any examples of good companies. I'm trying to think of good companies for us. I know we did a rating of Pentland, which is a family-owned, privately owned business. I know that they've done a lot of work looking at auditing the tiers. I know you talk about due diligence in their supply chain. I don't know whether you've only got good examples where that can highlight. One thing I did see today that I think Liam Byrne has made an amendment to a piece of legislation around fiduciary duty on companies to broaden fiduciary duty to look at environmental. I know Catherine Howard, the Share Action, put that on LinkedIn today, which I thought was an interesting news item, and she was encouraging people to write to MPs and to try and force that through, which I think kind of sits alongside initiatives like the Better Business Act and probably what you're doing as well, Dominique, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, hopefully that was of some use, Andy. I've asked a couple of questions there, so maybe
thank you, Stuart. Thank you very much indeed, Dominique. Any thoughts about good examples of companies doing, companies behaving well, and perhaps when you're ready to, let's take the conversation to a topic that John Hayworth initiated, the post office. Let's talk about the post office in this context of companies not behaving well. Dominique, over to you. Thanks, Stuart.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was really interesting. And I'm gonna start Googling what you do, and I might get in touch. Just briefly on Boohoo, because I worked for also Labour Behind the Label, which and I wrote a report on Boohoo that kicked off the scandal. And what annoyed me was several years later, one of the investors came back to me and said, "Can I have your help in taking a case against Boohoo for losing our members' money?" And it was I suppose it's slightly the injustice that an investor could do this when actually the investor had all the information right at the start to make a calculated decision about whether or not Boohoo was ethical, simply because of past experiences about the fashion industry. And then when you can compare that to the victims of Boohoo's exploitation, who have very little remedy. But I do agree, things are changing, investors are changing, and we're certainly pushing them to do more. And just two little interesting things that the government are doing. They're doing one, which is a national baseline assessment of how the UK performs its duties under the UN guiding principles. That national baseline assessment is being carried out by the FCDO. They're also, through the DBT, carrying out a review of responsible business conduct. And what we're doing at CJC is to make sure that those outcomes really highlight the need for binding legislation and not just, another, yes, it's bad and we need more voluntary, or we need more, patchwork. In terms of good companies, I wish I could I wish I could give you an example. I think just having researched specific supply chains, I think there are companies who approach it well and invest resources. And my experience has mainly been in the textile. But so, for example, just off the record, actually this is being recorded. So we have one example who I really appreciate because they not only do due diligence where they can, but they also engage very much with stakeholders, which is a key part of the UNGPs. They are quick to try and provide remedy, including where money is involved, because most companies don't like that aspect at all. But at the same time, their business model is impacting the environment because fast fashion is based on overproduction and overconsumption. So it's very difficult to find a good company, but you can find bits of companies. But overall, when we're talking big companies, yeah, it's difficult. I've no answer for that, I'm afraid. And on the post office, it was a brilliant question because it involves private companies, a public body, different levels of harm, a long process. And yeah, I don't have the answer, but I'm really excited to hear the discussion.
Thank you, Dominique. Let's talk about the post office. It's such a good example of such a bad organization. It seemed to lose the plot completely, didn't it? It seemed to get confused about what its own purpose was. It seemed to place so much emphasis on trying to defend its own reputation, willing to quite literally allow people it knew to be innocent to be sent to jail in an attempt to cover up on its own shenanigans. There must be something that goes really wrong in an organization when it loses its moral compass so badly that it can behave that way. And what's so sad about the post office scandal is if you accept that there are companies with individuals in it that will behave that badly, it makes you realize just how challenging it is to get organizations to behave in a very society-centric way, where they see their own purpose as being for the betterment of wider society. Um, Thank you very much, Dominique. Again, thank you, Stuart. Why don't we open the conversation up further? We'll come to Paul Bates in a little while, asking Paul to talk about the legal challenges in trying to get individuals to be properly held to account. But allow me to, I'm going to go to what we call gallery view so I can see everybody. Please do raise your hand if you'd like to come in. And Nigel, I know you've got views about this sort of stuff. I know that, for example, you've got views about, there we go, you've got views about how sometimes Parliament allows regulators, for example, the FCA, to be given the wrong brief. And as a consequence, because they have the wrong brief, they continue delivering in the wrong way. Nigel, what would you like to say about your thoughts on this important issue of corporate governance and what needs to be done to hold companies to account? Thanks, Nigel. Please take yourself off mute. Thank you. There we go. You almost forgot, sir. That's it. Lovely. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to ask Dominique a question. If I'm right in believing or understanding that the UK hasn't in fact ratified the European Court of Human Rights legislation, effectively it's unenforceable in British courts. And what are the practical consequences of that? It seems that though, this is very much sort of an area that we should be starting with here. It's highly political. And I noticed earlier on that you said that I think 70 MPs had signed to say that they were supportive. Are their names publishable? And further, just because MPs sign to say that they support, how many of those MPs would you anticipate in the fullness of time would practically engage and support, or are they just tick boxing because it looks good?
Just to help on that particular point, I found a link on the CJC site. I'll put it in the chat. I think this takes us to the list of organizations, sorry, list of parliamentarians who have co-signed the pledge. I'll put that in the chat. Thank you, Nigel. Dominique, over to you. Thank you. Dominique's just having a cough there.
Yes, apologies. Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's our Westminster facing website where we put the MPs. Some of them, so for example, actually, and I skipped that slide. Some parties we see, for example, the Lib Dems have quite a clear commitment to mandatory human rights due diligence. So we've got quite a big base of support there. Obviously, they're not in power. Labour is complex. There's a huge divide between the more radical, not even radical, the less centre-based MPs. We probably have about 10 that we rely on and that will raise parliamentary questions. So, for example, there's going to be a debate tomorrow on the NHS Procurement Act, and we've asked a couple of MPs to raise questions. So it really, some MPs, it's very basic support, and others, it's much deeper. Excuse me. Martin Wrigley, who sponsored the Better Business Act, he's actually a supporter of the pledge and is we've been in contact with him. In terms of the EU, the EU development is going on. There's been a huge pushback from business, from lobbying, and also from the far right, which is increasingly gaining control in Europe. There's also been legislation in France, Germany, Peru, Brazil, Thailand are discussing it at the moment. So one of the things I think government is aware of is that there will be at a certain point in the not too distant future a need for UK companies to be compliant to other standards when they want to export. So it's really a question of looking at other people's models. And for us, we see the UK model as at the moment as process orientated, which is why we've really tried to fit it into the British, the failure to prevent that sort of British model. So it'd be easier for the government, easier for businesses, and at the same time would ensure that they are compliant because it's all based on the UNGP. That there is a huge momentum, but we also know there is a big push for deregulation. The Labour government wants to reduce burdens on business by 25%, which is, yeah, it's a difficult time, but I think given what's going on in the world and with political shifts in the UK, it's, now is the time to really be pushing for this.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Dominique. Callie, I'm going to attempt to draw Callie into the conversation. If you'd like to join the conversation, Callie, please do so. But even if you don't, I'm going to just read out what you wrote. Callie wrote, Andy, mentioned recidivism. The same applies to the public sector giving contracts to the same rotten companies. I think Callie's point is really important, I say that because for the last couple of years, we've been a little bit involved with looking at procurement from the point of view of violation tracker. And the perspective is basically this. We understand the local government regulations mean that if a company's got a bad infringements record, a council should not be awarding that company juicy contracts.
Yeah.
But they're just ignoring it, even though, as I understand it, there are rules in place that do that. Is that something you're familiar with at all, Dominique? And perhaps Stuart will come in on that as well.
It's my colleague that works on public procurement, but we work quite a lot with Unison,
Yeah.
who actually their employers are public sector, and we've recently had a conference looking at public procurement itself. But you're right. There's lots of examples. I mean, G4S security is one that springs to mind in terms of human rights. But yeah.
Dominic, thank you. Stuart, does your work take you into the territory of procurement, particularly public sector procurement, which is what Callie raised? Stuart?
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, G4S is a good example of a company we actually did rate a long time ago. They didn't get a very good rating, as you might imagine. And I mean, from me looking at the other side of it, and touching on the post office as well, is how are these organisations vetted and decided that they're acceptable to be given contracts? I mean, I know Horizon, Fujitsu have kind of pulled away from tendering from any more projects. I guess that was a voluntary thing given the whole furore, but that's only come very relatively recently. I find it extraordinary that an organisation like G4S, and looking at some of the ongoing scandals and failures that they've had over a very, very long period of time, that they're considered to be a fit for purpose organisation. It comes back to a lot of the work that we do is when you look at it through the health of these organisations, and you look at it through what we call maturity or a human lens, they're often quite exploitative. They're often create very bad outcomes for workers or suppliers or whoever, and yet they are given government contracts. And I quite it's sort of decide how we measure the success of an organization, the health of an organization seems to be and even then we get it wrong, right? So companies like Carillion is a good example, that failed, left a hospital in Liverpool unbuilt for many, many years, failed as a company, and was being, being awarded all these contracts to do this kind of work. So in answer to your question, Andy, yes, we do get involved, not necessarily from government. I mean, I'd love to get involved and help the government and say, look, shouldn't we be at least considering, what these organizations look like in terms of their, their cultural health, if you like, in the same way that I think banking regulators should be looking at the banks through that lens as well, not just necessarily, because we don't have an independent view as to how we're looking at these organizations from a health perspective, and we wonder why, we're suddenly, how does Palantir get all these government contracts, right? Is anybody looking at that as an organization, and the underlying motive of that organization in terms of the business that it's doing, and what are they in business for, right? And I don't think many people. It's interesting. I did work with some equity analysts, and we looked at Palantir as part of, and I would just raise the question. I said, "Are you sure you want to be, saying this is a buy for this company, given their involvement with Palantir, for example? When you start to look at who this company is run by and the motives, et cetera, et cetera." So, I think there's lots of more questions being asked, but fundamentally, coming back to how do we decide whether organizations are fit to be doing the kind of work they're doing on our behalf of extraordinary, particularly, I guess, you can look at all the major consultants and how many government contracts they get and how much money they make on which spending out, taxpayer money. And we did a piece of work, you may remember, Andy, which got used by Prem Sikka in a Labour Party before they entered government, which was on the audit industry, because we rated the big four accounting firms, and they used that as part of I know Prem used that as part of his report to say, look, the accounting firms they're not in it for us, they're in it to drive the top line for their partners, and therefore there's little wonder that the Carillions happen because the auditors are not incentivized to be doing their jobs. So accountability is not just accountability of the firms themselves, it's accountability of all, the banks, the auditors, and the investors, and the whole ecosystem which fits around it. But I'll stop there. I'll just
Thank you very much. It's interesting because you mentioned the audit firms. Also, Dominic did too. I'll just put a link in the chat to the PwC scandal in Australia, which is absolutely massive. When you read what PwC have been doing in Australia, and in fact in other parts of the world, it is as if they're been acting with impunity, as if there's no way they're going to get caught. I mean, it's just ridiculously egregious conduct. Charging all kinds of fees for all kinds of things. Let's invite Paul Bates, barrister, to introduce himself and talk about these issues from a legal point of view. Paul, I mean, it's tough enough to have laws getting people to do things that are quite simple and binary. Getting organizations to behave properly and to be better to society and the planet, etc. This must be quite a challenge from a legal point of view. Anything you'd like to say about this kind of challenge, Paul, as a barrister?
Well, thank you very much. I'm a Canadian practitioner of commercial and civil litigation and frequently class actions, recently UK qualified, and so I enjoy so very much the TTF events. I think the first problem is access to justice. To mount a case in the UK and Canada, less so, but still significantly difficult, is an enormous challenge. In the UK, there isn't omnibus class actions legislation. Major human rights claims against UK mining companies, for example, for misconduct in Africa or South America, are done as group actions, and it's very difficult to put those together. The financing needed to conduct them is hundreds, dozens at least, of millions of pounds. So it's a very, I believe there's a very serious problem of access to justice. In Canada, it's mitigated somewhat with class actions legislation that's grown up in the last half of my career in all the provinces, but the courts struggle with it and resist it. And the judges all come from defense firms, and they're just not minded to the travails of ordinary people and so on. So there's a tremendous access to justice problem, and it's hard to find, I think, good quality lawyers who are willing to pursue those cases effectively. They're all on the other side. I was recently asked to speak to a group of, it must have been 50 or 60 corporate lawyers, and I said, that's just like another day in class action court. You're all against me. You don't want to listen to anything I have to say. You're opposed before I even start. I'm used to it. That's what I said to them. So, and I think then in terms of the substantive law, we have incidental reforms in Canada, for example, where there's some director liability for unpaid wages or unsafe workplaces. It's specific sectors and targets, and they're always subject to a due diligence defense, which they can mount in a court system that's very receptive to their point of view. So it does feel like a huge battle. But I was inspired by Dominic's presentation, and I'm interested in what you feel about the importance of the UK developing access to justice by class actions, and not just at the competition tribunal for economic misconduct. Is it something your organization has considered pressing for?
Shall I answer that?
Yeah.
I'm more interested in hearing you speak more, but we do, because there's four of us, we have very limited capacity. We've done some strategic litigation, and our partners have. So Friends of the Earth. We've also got Lee Day, someone from Lee Day who's on our board, which is great. But what we also do is NCP complaints through the OECD guidelines. So National Contact Point complaints. So primarily because they're easier and cheaper, they do not provide any remedy at all, usually.
Mm-hmm.
They take years, but they are good as a tool to push companies and states. In terms of, victims and survivors taking big companies to court, you said it well. It's the barriers are just enormous. And I think someone said it in the chat, the financial barriers, the time barriers, the power inequality. It's almost impossible. So that's one of the reasons why we've thought very carefully about the defense for companies, but also reversing that burden of proof.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is so interesting. I've never even heard of, and I don't mind admitting it, I've never even heard of the National Contact Point. I've just found it online, and I put a link in the chat to it for others like me who might not be afraid of revealing their ignorance on such an important issue. My goodness me, really, really important. I'll tell you what, folks, I'm going to share my screen again to talk about something that I've become very, very interested in, and also a little bit suspicious of. I'll explain, he says, for dramatic effect. This is the Public Office Accountability Bill. It's actually known by many names, including the Hillsborough Law. So the idea here is basically that public bodies must tell the truth. And of course, as you'll know from disasters like Hillsborough, contaminated blood, Grenfell, and many others, there has been a pattern whereby a public body gets something really wrong, and instead of admitting and putting it right, they go into cover-up mode. And in many of these cases, there's at least the perception of corruption, quite likely the actuality of corruption. So the Hillsborough Law, or the Public Office Accountability Bill, is an attempt to eradicate that kind of institutional cover-up mode. I'll read it out. These words are important. There's a particular bit I'll draw your attention to because it's worrying me. Long title. A bill to impose a duty on public authorities and public officials to act with candor, transparency, and frankness, to make provision for the enforcement of that duty in their dealings with inquiries and investigations, to require public authorities to promote and take steps to maintain ethical conduct within all parts of the authority, to create an offence in relation to public authorities and public officials who mislead the public, i.e., you must not lie anymore. To create further offences in relation to the misconduct of persons who hold public office, and this is the bit I'll come back to, and to abolish the common law offence of misconduct in public office. I'll come back to that in a minute. To make provisions enabling persons to participate in inquiries and investigations where the conduct of public authorities may be in issue and for connected purposes. So this is working its way through Parliament now. It's next stage is the committee stage. That's where they go and look at all the detail and make recommendations. On the surface, it all looks great. It's all about enabling exactly this event's all about, to hold public bodies to account. Let me go back to this particular bit that I said is a bit of a concern. To abolish the common law offence of misconduct in public office. Sorry, my computer's going funny. There we go. When you look at the small print in this legislation, bearing in mind I'm no lawyer, when you look at the small print, it does explain quite clearly that they are looking to abolish the common law offence of misconduct in public office. They're also looking to replace that with two new laws, which on the surface seem to suggest that they would do a better job than what the offence of misconduct in public office does. But when you look at the small print inside the small print, there's a very interesting piece of detail. Basically, you can only bring the new law into effect if you have got permission from the Department for Public Prosecutions. Whereas currently, as I understand it, anybody can bring a claim under misconduct in public office. So on one hand, this legislation is supposedly making it easier to hold public bodies to account. On the other hand, by getting rid of misconduct in public office and replacing it with laws that can only become operative if you get the DPP to support the claim, you are in effect creating a filtering mechanism. And those of you who might be cynically minded, perhaps like I am, might say to yourself, well, hold on. If you've got to get permission to be able to use that law, then what controls will there be to stop the law from being used? Interesting thoughts. Does anybody have any comments on that? Anybody like to share any thoughts about what might be going on here? It's a really interesting topic, and we're spending a fair amount of time on this, trying to deal with that issue, but also deal with another issue. There's another issue, I'll touch on it briefly, to do with which public bodies are caught by this new legislation. We have reason to believe that some organisations, perhaps the Financial Conduct Authority, may not be deemed to be a public body. The logic is the FCA is not funded by the government, it's funded by levies. And if the definition of what's caught is funded by the government, then maybe the FCA would be out of scope. We don't know yet. We're still looking into it. Stuart, Dominique, Nigel, anybody, John Hayworth, anybody like to share thoughts on what might be going on here? Are we actually being sold a pup? Is the Hillsborough Law something that might actually make it less easy to hold companies to account? John, do you want to chip into the conversation here?
Why not? Why not? Good evening, everybody. John Hayworth. I'm sitting in northern France at the moment at home. I spent a life in the heavy construction industry and heavily involved in enforcing health and safety regulations, particularly 30 years overseas in the Middle East with Asian workforces, and also in India. As another aside, I noticed just after you started, Dominique, there was a chart there. What was it called? Anyway, it had various countries on it, and one of them was Colombia. And when I looked really hard at the screen, it was Cerrejón, for which I worked for 6 months on a major mining expansion project down there in Bogota. So I'm curious to know what they might have done wrong, because actually they did an awful lot to please the locals. Anyway, that's by the by. But yes, coming back to the point, and Andy, the question is, I suppose, of somebody such as Paul, what would you, if you were representing the defence in all of this, how would you try and manipulate the way that law is written to your advantage?
So I think you're asking an interesting question here. How would the other side try to
Yeah, exactly. That's always how you have to look at things. Yeah.
The way out of this. I think Paul might be away from his desk because he's turned his camera
Oh,
off.
shame.
Let's go to Stuart Woodard. Stuart, what are your thoughts about the way companies might try to weasel their way out of it? While you're doing that, I'm going to go and let somebody in. Bear with me.
I think John's already given us, the natural, I mean, I think we've touched upon this. The natural response of companies is I mean, how many companies put their hand up and say, "Oh yeah, we're going to own this and we're going to deal with it"? They don't. I mean, the first response or a typical response is denial, right? It's not. This is nothing to do with us. Or if they're pushed, I mean, I recently looked at AstraZeneca. The reason I did that, we did some work on AstraZeneca quite a long time ago, and I pointed out at the time that they had some cultural and systemic issues, Dominique, coming back to that point, and that issues around bribery were not going to go away. And relatively recently, they had another issue with bribery, and Sorio, the CEO, finally came out and said, this is beyond the system. So I mean, coming back to the point, I think that. Look at Boeing. Boeing is another good example. Aircraft falling out of the sky. Company goes into denial. It takes a very long period of time before finally they're having to force to admit that they've got system issues, that they're culpable because they compromise quality by canning jobs, pulling resources, managing the financial return of the company. Even today, it's 6 or 7 years later. That I think they're on their second new CEO who's finally starting to hopefully resolve some issues, because none of us want to fly on a Boeing aircraft that's potentially got quality issues. Yes. I think Boeing is a good recent example of the tendency of how companies react to failures. And coming back to John's point, they will look for ways out. And I think coming back to the point that I think Paul was making, we had an issue with, can't say who, a major US technology firm who's got, one of the richest men in the world as their founders because they copied our work. And we didn't have the money to take them. It's just, this isn't human rights. It was an intellectual property issue. But I think it's systemic of how issues of justice, are not easily accessible to in lots of different ways, particularly the way companies work. And I think, going back to, you can go back to the 1970s, Ford and making a car called the Pinto, decided not to fix the issue because they'd rather pay the money when people claimed. I mean, this is just the nature of the system is still, doesn't work.
Stuart, that car situation, the Pinto, is that the one that was like randomly catching fire, but it was too embarrassing to deal with it, so they didn't?
It was worse than that. They said that it was cheaper to pay claims.
Oh yes.
People would get injured or killed. It was cheaper to do that than to fix the car.
Yeah, it's bloody. Oh, excuse my language. I nearly swore then.
I mean,
that was awful, wasn't it?
I mean, look at DuPont. Look at DuPont. And if there's a great new, relatively recent film around, I can't remember what it's called, Dark Waters, I think it's called, something like that, and just issues of Teflon. Those issues are still outstanding today, I think, and people weren't given. Coming back, we look at Hillsborough, we look at the post office in the States. The victims of toxic chemicals put in local rivers that killed farm animals first, but in human beings not too far away. Those issues went on for decades, and I think it was only late 2017 when payouts were starting to really be made in a significant, maybe a bit before that. But I think, again, coming back to what John said, the natural reaction of these companies is to use extensive financial muscle to kick the can down the road, to find ways, and just, it's a bit like a Trumpian thing. Trump plays out time, right? It's about just kicking these things so far into the future that, look at post office. Post office victims are dying, right? They don't get anything. They're this justice hasn't been served, and they're dying. Same with DuPont and lots of these examples, I think.
It's thanks, Stuart. That's really interesting, and thank you also, Dominic, for putting that link to the Hillsborough Law grounds for optimism point in the chat. I'll take a look at that in a moment. Do you know what? I often say to myself, it's as if I start to sound like a really old man. It's as if there's a complete degradation of standards in society. A very general point like that. The world's coming to an end. I'm sure it might be. Kevin put himself off mute. I wonder if that's because Kevin wanted to chip into the conversation. If that is the case, Kevin, feel free to come into the conversation in a moment. But first, we're going to go to Nigel Cairns. Then we're going to go to Dominique for some final comments. Then we'll probably wrap up. Nigel, to you, sir. To you.
Yes, just to comment. What concerns me greatly is the overwhelming lobbying power that UK finance has in respect of influencing, it would appear, government policy very directly. And the fact that there's no counterbalance or countervailing lobbying capability from anybody else. And it seems to me as though this is just the meltdown of democracy itself. If just one side is holding all the cards, and basically, as far as I can see, UK finance keeps saying to the government, you're not going to get growth unless you do what we say. This isn't going to work, that isn't going to work. We hold all the cards. And basically, you do what we say, or you won't get growth, and you won't stay in power. And it's just basically a sort of a blackmail situation almost going on.
I think that's a really important point, Nigel. Dominic mentioned deregulation earlier. This whole kind of deregulate for growth agenda, I think it's misplaced, because what's going to happen is they will deregulate, they'll get rid of red tape and bureaucracy. That bit's fine, but they'll also lose consumer protections. And as a consequence of those protections going, more people are going to get harmed. What happens when you have people who are harmed? You get bad publicity. That erodes the trust dynamic. People will buy less from banks, insurance companies, pension companies, and all the rest of it. So this idea of getting rid of something that's meant to help people and protect people as a way to get more people to buy products and services, I think is just irrational. It just doesn't add up in my mind.
Well, I think one thing's for sure is that the companies that are represented, companies like all the major banks and what have you, by UK finance, are almost certainly going to benefit financially very greatly from all the policy measures that they're suggesting that the government should take on the back, the promise that this will deliver growth. Well, it'll certainly deliver huge bonuses and personal wealth for the senior management of those companies. And I would say that is their primary interest in their own pockets. And the government is very, foolish it defies belief that, they get sucked in to the extent that they do. Perhaps there's other facets to it that aren't necessarily revealed to us. I don't know.
Maybe. I can see Dominic nodding away there. I think Dominic gave a clue earlier that she might be quite on that wavelength. I'm going to mention this book. I mentioned it just before the session started to Dominic, Rigged by Andy Verity. It's basically about the whistleblowers and the whole issue to do with libel rigging and stuff. The reason I mention it is because if you read this, it talks about the BBA, the British Bankers Association, I think it was called, which I think I'm right in saying was the forerunner to what is now known as UK finance, and huge question marks, some might say, allegedly, around the BBA's involvement with LIBOR and what went on there. I think you're right, Nigel. I think that two quotes come to mind which explain all this. One is the Charlie Munger quote, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." I mean that explains what 90% of human behavior. people will do what they're incentivized to do in whatever the situation is. And if they are currently incentivized to lobby to maximize profits for the banks they work for, et cetera, then that's exactly what's going to happen. The other quote that comes to mind is, if I were thee, how would I be? Maybe we would behave the same if we were in their situation. We're going to go to Dominique for her final comments and wrapping the session up. Dominique, it's been great to have you with us. Thanks for stimulating tonight's conversation. Anything you'd like to say in closing the event, Dominique, and then I'll wrap up formally after that. Thank you.
It's been brilliant listening to this and learning so much about how it all fits together. And I think many of the lessons and cases that you guys have been working on and sharing, they fit in so well with what our partners are doing in other sectors. And I think just as a sort of takeaway, I think on deregulation, I really like the work of a group called Unseen. I don't know if you know it, but they look a
Right.
lot on regulation in the UK and the consumer's need for it. But I think it also, what tonight has really solidified is how having a holistic law would be really valuable rather than cutting a bit of red tape here, adding a little bit
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
creating new, as you pointed out, new possible crimes, which abolish a bigger or more useful crime. But we all need clarity, and I think we recognise that the power imbalance is bonkers. That's my final academic thought on the matter.
I think you're right. The power balance is bonkers. And as a result of that, those of us who are weak are exploited and picked on by bullies. It's a David and Goliath thing all over again, isn't it? However, there is hope. There's hope in the duty of candor bill. There's hope in the legislation that Dominique's organisation is championing so well. What we must all know and agree on is that we mustn't be quiet. When we know things are happening that are wrong, when we see organizations getting away with stuff they shouldn't be getting away with, let's stand up, not stand by. Let's do what we can to protest directly through our MPs, through the newspapers, because if we don't, we are condoning what's going on. And if we condone what's going on, we're effectively inviting companies to continue to behave badly. We mustn't do that. We mustn't do that. Because if we do that, what on earth is it going to be like 20, 30, 40 years from now? You know, we've got massive forces at work to do with all kinds of things that have got the capacity to really, really screw up society. AI, climate, corporate greed, democracy under threat. There's a long list of things to be concerned about. All the time, there's at least one person who hasn't given up. There's hope. And all the time, we have organizations like Dominique's thinking things through, championing the way forward. We can get behind it. We can do what we can to help. Can we please once again show our appreciation to Dominique? I think we all enjoyed that conversation greatly, Dominique. Thank you to you. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Nigel. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody who's chipped in the conversation. And have a great evening. And quite miraculously, we've actually finished at exactly the right time. That happens about once a year. Thanks all very much. Good evening, all. Thank you. Good night. Good.